Chapter 1. The Ordinary Light of Morning. The coffee was always too weak at Riverside General Hospital, but Dr. Sarah Chen had long since stopped complaining about it. She stood in the staff lounge on the third floor, watching steam rise from her styrofoam cup while the first pale light of dawn crept through the windows. Outside, the Missouri River moved slowly past the building, dark and patient, carrying whatever the night had given it toward the sea. It was October 1953, and Sarah had been working at Riverside General for just over 2 years. At 31, she was one of only 3 female physicians on staff, a fact that her mother mentioned with pride at every possible opportunity and that her male colleagues acknowledged with varying degrees of grudging respect or thinly veiled resentment. She had learned to navigate both responses with the same careful neutrality she brought to most things in her life. The lounge was empty at this hour. Sarah preferred it that way. She had another 20 minutes before her rounds began, and she used the time the way she always did, reviewing charts, making notes in her precise handwriting, preparing herself mentally for the day ahead. Medicine, she had discovered, was largely about preparation. If you anticipated the complications, stayed one step ahead of the infections and the hemorrhages and the sudden crashes, you could save lives. If you were caught off guard, people died. She had been caught off guard exactly once during her residency in Chicago. A young man, 23 years old, had come in with what seemed like routine appendicitis. By the time they realized his appendix had already ruptured, peritonitis had set in. He died on the operating table while Sarah held retractors, watching helplessly as his blood pressure dropped and his heart gave out. She remembered his mother's face when they told her. She remembered the way the woman had simply nodded, as if she had expected this all along, as if losing a son was just another ordinary thing that happened on ordinary days. Sarah had promised herself she would never be caught off guard again. The door to the lounge opened, and Dr. James Morrison walked in, already pulling a cigarette from his coat pocket. He was 46, chief of internal medicine, and had the kind of weathered handsomeness that came from too many late nights and too much responsibility. He'd been kind to Sarah when she first arrived, had vouched for her when the hospital board questioned whether they should hire another woman physician. She owed him, and they both knew it. "Early again," Morrison said, lighting his cigarette. "You know, Chin, you're making the rest of us look bad." "Someone has to maintain standards," Sarah replied, allowing herself a small smile. Morrison poured himself coffee and stood beside her at the window. For a moment they both watched the river. A barge was moving upstream, loaded with something covered in tarps. Coal probably. Or grain. The river carried everything. "I wanted to talk to you about something," Morrison said, and there was a note in his voice that made Sarah look up from her charts. "Before rounds. Got a minute?" Sarah nodded, closing her folder. Morrison took a long drag on his cigarette, then exhaled slowly. "We're going to be getting some new patients. Starting next week. Maybe as early as Monday." "All right," Sarah said. This wasn't unusual. Riverside General served a large area of western Missouri, and patient populations fluctuated constantly. "What kind of cases?" "Mixed," Morrison said. He wasn't looking at her now, was studying his coffee instead. "The thing is, these patients are part of a study. A nutrition study run through the Department of Health. They're looking at nutritional deficiencies in rural populations, trying to establish baseline data for public health interventions." Sarah waited. There was more coming. She could hear it in the careful way Morrison was choosing his words. "The study participants will be staying here in the hospital for observation. They'll be getting their meals here, controlled portions, that sort of thing. The government is funding the whole thing. It's good for the hospital, we're getting a significant budget allocation. And it's good for the patients. They'll get full medical workups, care they probably couldn't afford otherwise." "How many patients?" Sarah asked. 30 initially. Could be more later. They'll be spread across different wards, but I want you to be the primary physician for the ones in general medicine. I'm putting you in charge of their day-to-day care." Sarah considered this. It was a significant responsibility, and the fact that Morrison was giving it to her meant something. Recognition, perhaps. Or a test. "What exactly will I be doing? Beyond the standard care?" "Monitoring," Morrison said. "Taking samples mostly. Blood work, urine samples, that kind of thing. Recording observations. The government will send someone to collect the data weekly. It's straightforward work, really. Just requires attention to detail." He smiled. "Which is why I thought of you." There was something in his tone that bothered Sarah, something she couldn't quite name. "These participants," she said slowly, "they've consented to this? They understand they're part of a study?" "Of course," Morrison said, perhaps a bit too quickly. "They're all volunteers. The health department recruited them from the county. Most of them are from pretty desperate circumstances. These are people who need help, and this way they get medical care, 3 meals a day, a bed. It's a good thing, Sarah. For everyone involved. Sarah looked at him carefully. James Morrison was not a dishonest man, but he was a pragmatic one. He believed in the greater good, in the advancement of medical knowledge, in doing what needed to be done even when it wasn't comfortable. She respected that about him, even when it made her uneasy. "I'll need to see the study protocols," she said, "before the patients arrive." "Naturally," Morrison said. "I'll have them sent to your office." He stubbed out his cigarette in the ashtray on the windowsill. "This is going to be good for your career, you know. Government work looks good on a resume. Opens doors." After Morrison left, Sarah remained at the window, watching the barge disappear around the river's bend. She thought about doors opening and wondered what else might come through them. By the time Sarah finished her morning rounds, it was nearly 10 o'clock. She had 16 patients under her care. 2 with pneumonia, 1 recovering from a stroke, 3 diabetics requiring insulin regulation, and a handful of others with various ailments that filled the ordinary catalog of human suffering. Mrs. Patterson in 304 was dying, though no one had said so explicitly yet. Mr. Kowalski in 318 would probably live to see his grandchildren graduate high school, assuming he followed his medication schedule, which he wouldn't. Sarah made her notes carefully, spoke to each patient with the same measured kindness, and tried not to think about the 30 new patients who would be arriving on Monday. She ate lunch in the cafeteria with Dr. Ruth Hargrove, the only other woman physician at Riverside General. Ruth was 53, had worked at the hospital for 22 years, and had a way of seeing through administrative nonsense that Sarah found both admirable and slightly terrifying. "I heard about Morrison's nutrition study," Ruth said without preamble as she sat down with her tray of meatloaf and green beans. "You're taking point on it." "News travels fast," Sarah said. "It always does." Ruth cut a piece of meatloaf with the side of her fork. "You know anything about this study? Who's running it?" "Department of Health, apparently. Morrison said they're looking at nutritional deficiencies." Ruth made a non-committal sound. "Department of Health has deep pockets these days. All that federal money flowing into public health programs since the war ended." She chewed thoughtfully. "Just seems like an odd place to run a nutrition study, doesn't it? A hospital?" Sarah had been thinking the same thing but hadn't wanted to voice it. Morrison said the participants need medical supervision. Hum. Ruth took a sip of her coffee, made a face at its weakness and set it down. "Well, maybe I'm just cynical. 22 years in this place will do that to you." She looked at Sarah with something that might have been concern. "Just keep your eyes open, all right? Government studies aren't always what they seem." "What do you mean?" Ruth was quiet for a moment, seeming to weigh her words. "I have a friend," she said finally, "who worked at a sanatorium in Alabama. A few years back, early 40s. They had a study going on there too. Government funded. Testing treatments for syphilis, they said." She paused. "Except they weren't testing treatments at all. They were just watching what happened when they didn't treat people. Even after penicillin became available." Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. "That can't be right." "I'm just telling you what she told me," Ruth said. "And she could have been mistaken. Or exaggerating. People do." She finished her meatloaf and pushed her tray aside. "I'm just saying keep your eyes open. Document everything. If something doesn't feel right, it probably isn't." After Ruth left, Sarah sat alone at the table looking at her half-eaten sandwich. Around her, the cafeteria hummed with the ordinary sounds of institutional life. Trays clattering, conversations murmuring, the distant clang of the kitchen. Everything was normal. Everything was the same as it had been yesterday and would be tomorrow. She thought about the young man who had died in Chicago, how quickly everything could change, how fragile the line was between healing and harm. That evening, Sarah walked home through streets that smelled of chimney smoke and fallen leaves. She lived in a small apartment 3 blocks from the hospital, close enough to come in quickly if there was an emergency, far enough to maintain some boundary between her work and her life. Sarah made herself dinner, scrambled eggs and toast, and sat at her kitchen table with the study protocols Morrison had left in her office that afternoon. The document was surprisingly thin, only 15 pages, typed on official Department of Health letterhead. Nutritional Assessment Study, Rural Population Health Outcomes, the title page read. Sarah read carefully, making notes in the margins as she went. The study's stated purpose was to establish baseline nutritional data for rural populations in the Midwest. 30 participants would be housed at Riverside General for 6 months, receiving standardized meals and undergoing regular medical examinations. But as Sarah read further, she began to notice the gaps. The protocol specified weekly blood draws but didn't specify what would be done with the results. There was no mention of treatment for any deficiencies found. No control group. The consent procedures were vague, just a brief mention of verbal consent obtained by county health workers. Sarah closed the protocol folder and pressed her palms against her eyes. She thought about what Ruth had said. Government studies aren't always what they seem. She didn't sleep well that night. Monday morning arrived too quickly. The patients came in buses, 30 people carrying small bags containing everything they owned. Sarah met the first one at 9:15. Her name was Alice Brenner, 42 years old, though she looked older. She was thin in a way that spoke of chronic hunger, and when Sarah showed her to the hospital bed, Alice touched the white sheets carefully as if they might disappear. "This is for me?" Alice asked. "The whole bed?" "Yes," Sarah said. "This is your room." Alice's eyes filled with tears. "It's nice. Real nice." Sarah sat down beside the bed. "Mrs. Brenner, can you tell me what you understand about why you're here?" "For the help," Alice said. "The county woman said I could get medical help and meals and a place to stay. She said it wouldn't cost nothing." "Did she tell you about a study? About tests we'll be doing?" Alice's confusion deepened. "She said I'd get checked by a doctor. Said you'd help me get healthy." Sarah made notes in the chart, her hands steady even as her mind raced. Over the next 2 hours, she interviewed 9 more patients. Their stories were similar, desperate people who had been promised help. None of them understood they were part of a study. None of them had signed consent forms. By noon, Sarah's unease had hardened into certainty. Something was wrong. She found Morrison in his office. "They don't know," Sarah said, closing the door. "The patients, they don't know they're part of a study." Morrison set down his pen. "Sarah, I need to see the consent forms. The actual signed documents." Morrison walked to his window, hands in his pockets. "There are no consent forms," he said finally. Sarah felt the floor shift beneath her. "These people are receiving medical care they desperately need," Morrison continued. "Without this study, they'd have nothing." "You can't experiment on people without their knowledge," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "Is it wrong to try to understand nutritional deficiencies so we can help millions in the future?" Morrison turned to face her. "These people are suffering anyway. At least this way their suffering means something. They deserve to know. They deserve to choose. And if they choose to leave?" Morrison shook his head. "They'll go back to their lives and keep suffering and we'll have learned nothing." Sarah thought about Alice Brenner, touching the white sheets with wonder. "I can't do this." Morrison's expression softened. "The study is happening whether you're involved or not. The only question is whether you're going to be there to make sure these people are cared for, or whether you're going to walk away and leave them to someone who might not care as much." It was a trap and Sarah knew it. But it was also true. "I need time to think," Sarah said. "Take the evening. But I need your answer tomorrow morning." Sarah left and walked to the river entrance. She stood on the steps watching the water flow past, carrying its burdens toward the sea. She thought about the oath she had taken. First, do no harm. But what if the harm was already being done? The river had no answers. Sarah stood there until sunset painted the water gold and red, the colors of warning, the colors of endings. Then she walked back inside into the fluorescent lights and antiseptic smell and rows of beds where people slept, trusting that strangers in white coats would tell them the truth. She didn't know yet what she would do. She only knew that by tomorrow she would have to decide what kind of doctor she was going to be. In her pocket, her hand found the small notebook where she kept her observations. She thought about Ruth's words, document everything. Perhaps that was all she could do. Bear witness. Write it down. Make sure someone would remember. It wasn't enough, but it might be all she had. Chapter 2, The Weight of Silence. The blood draws began on Wednesday morning, exactly as Morrison had said they would. Sarah arrived at the hospital before dawn, unable to sleep, unwilling to face the silence of her apartment any longer. She had spent the previous day moving through her duties like a sleepwalker, checking vitals, reviewing charts, speaking to her patients with a practiced gentleness that felt increasingly hollow. She had not given Morrison a verbal answer, but her presence in the hospital, her continued rounds, her careful attention to the 10 patients under her care, these things were answer enough. She had chosen complicity over courage. She had chosen to stay. Now, standing in the supply room as the sky outside turned from black to gray, Sarah prepared the equipment she would need. Syringes, tourniquets, collection tubes with color-coded tops, labels for each sample, cotton swabs and bandages. The familiar ritual of preparation felt different this morning, tainted by knowledge. These weren't tools of healing anymore. They were instruments of extraction, of surveillance, of something she still couldn't quite name but that sat in her stomach like spoiled meat. The first patient on her list was Alice Brenner. Sarah found her awake and dressed, sitting on the edge of her bed with her hands folded in her lap. In the 3 days since her arrival, Alice had already begun to look different. The deep hollows under her eyes had softened slightly, her skin had lost some of its grayish tinge. The simple act of eating regular meals and sleeping in a warm bed was beginning to heal her, and Sarah felt a painful gratitude for this small mercy even as she prepared to violate the trust that made such healing possible. "Good morning, Mrs. Brenner," Sarah said, keeping her voice steady and professional. "How are you feeling today?" "Much better, doctor," Alice said, and her smile was genuine. "I can't remember the last time I slept so well. And the breakfast this morning, eggs and toast and real butter. I thought I was dreaming." Sarah set her tray of equipment on the bedside table and pulled up a chair. "I'm glad you're comfortable. I need to take some blood samples this morning. It's part of your medical assessment, to see how your nutrition has been affecting your health." Alice's smile faded slightly, replaced by a flicker of worry. "Is something wrong? Are you checking for something bad?" No, Sarah said quickly, hating herself for the lie. "This is standard procedure. We're just establishing a baseline, seeing where you are now so we can track your improvement." "Oh." Alice relaxed. "That makes sense. You want to see me getting better." "Yes," Sarah said, and at least this part was true. She did want to see Alice getting better. She wanted all of them to get better. The question was what price they would pay for that improvement, and whether they would ever be told about the cost. Sarah tied the tourniquet around Alice's thin arm and tapped at the inside of her elbow, searching for a vein. Alice's veins were small and rolling, made difficult by years of dehydration and poor nutrition. It took Sarah 2 attempts to get the needle in properly, and she felt Alice flinch both times. "I'm sorry," Sarah murmured. "I know this isn't pleasant." "It's all right," Alice said, looking away from the dark red blood flowing into the collection tube. "My husband used to say I had stubborn veins. Said they didn't want to give up anything they didn't have to." She laughed softly. "He was right about that." Sarah filled 3 tubes, purple top for the complete blood count, red top for serum chemistry, gray top for glucose levels, and carefully labeled each one with Alice's name and patient number. A07. The dehumanization of the numbering system wasn't lost on Sarah. It was easier to experiment on A07 than on Alice Brenner, widow, sister, woman who cried over soft beds and real butter. "All done," Sarah said, pressing cotton to the puncture site and taping it down. "You'll need to keep pressure on this for a few minutes." "When will you know the results?" Alice asked. Sarah paused. This was another question she didn't know how to answer. According to the protocol, the samples would be picked up by a government courier every Friday and sent to a laboratory in Washington. Results would be compiled into aggregate data reports, but individual patient results would not be returned to the hospital. Sarah would never see Alice's actual lab values. She would never know what deficiencies were being found, what abnormalities were developing, what warning signs were being ignored. "The results take some time to process," Sarah said finally. "But don't worry, if there's anything concerning, we'll make sure you get the treatment you need." Another lie. Or was it? Sarah genuinely didn't know what would happen if the tests revealed something serious. Would Morrison allow treatment, or would that interfere with the study's data? She hadn't asked because she was afraid of the answer. Alice nodded, trusting, and Sarah felt the weight of that trust like a stone pressing on her chest. She moved through the rest of her patients methodically, drawing blood from each of them, offering the same reassurances, telling the same half-truths. Some were apprehensive, needles made everyone nervous, but none of them questioned the necessity of the procedure. They believed Sarah when she said it was for their benefit. They believed because they had been taught to believe in doctors, in hospitals, in the institutions that claimed to care for them. By noon, Sarah had collected samples from all 10 of her patients and delivered them to the collection area that had been set up in a locked room on the first floor. A technician she didn't recognize was organizing the tubes in refrigerated storage units, preparing them for Friday's pickup. He worked with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had done this many times before, who saw the tubes as data points rather than pieces of living people. Sarah watched him work and wondered how many other studies were running like this one, in how many other hospitals, collecting how many other samples from how many other people who didn't know they were being studied. The thought made her dizzy. That afternoon, Sarah attended the weekly staff meeting in the hospital's administrative conference room. Morrison had invited a guest, Dr. Harold Brennan, the principal investigator for the nutrition study. Dr. Brennan looked nothing like Sarah had imagined. She had pictured someone older, more bureaucratic, perhaps wearing a military uniform. Instead, Dr. Brennan was probably in his early 40s, handsome in a bland way, with the kind of easy smile that suggested he found the world generally agreeable and himself particularly clever. He stood at the head of the table and spoke for 20 minutes about nutritional deficiencies, about the challenges of studying impoverished populations, about the scientific rigor required to produce meaningful results. He used words like statistically significant and controlled variables and longitudinal analysis. He made it all sound noble and necessary and utterly reasonable. He did not use the word consent even once. When he finished, Morrison opened the floor for questions. Dr. Ruth Hargrove raised her hand. Dr. Brennan, Ruth said, her voice pleasant but pointed, what are the ethical safeguards for this study? Who's providing oversight? Brennan's smile didn't waver. Excellent question. The study has been reviewed and approved by the Department of Health's Internal Ethics Committee. We're following all applicable guidelines for human subjects research. It was a masterful non-answer, Sarah thought. It sounded authoritative while actually saying nothing concrete. Ruth pressed further. And the participants themselves, they understand the nature of the study? They've been fully informed. For the first time, Brennan's smile tightened. The participants have been informed by trained county health workers and have volunteered to participate. We're offering these individuals medical care they desperately need. The study protocol allows us to provide that care while advancing medical knowledge. It's mutually beneficial. But have they signed consent forms? Ruth asked. Do they understand they're part of a research study? The room went very quiet. Sarah could feel the tension rising. Brennan's smile disappeared. Dr. Hargrove, I appreciate your concern. However, these individuals are not equipped to understand complex scientific protocols. Attempting to explain the intricacies of longitudinal nutritional studies to people with limited education would only confuse and frighten them. What they understand is that they're receiving medical care, which is absolutely true. With respect, Dr. Brennan, Ruth said, steel in her voice now, I don't think you can separate the research from the care. If you're drawing blood primarily to collect data rather than to treat the patient, that's research. And research requires informed consent. Morrison stood abruptly. I think we're getting off track. Dr. Hargrove, perhaps we can discuss your concerns after the meeting. It was a dismissal, polite but firm. Ruth held Morrison's gaze for a long moment, then nodded and sat back. But Sarah could see the anger in her eyes and the fear. The meeting concluded shortly after. Sarah walked back to her ward feeling sick, the weight of what she was part of settling more heavily on her shoulders with each step. Chapter 3, Revelation. It was in the 5th week that Sarah first noticed something was wrong. Alice Brenner had been complaining of headaches for several days. Nothing severe, she insisted, just a persistent ache behind her eyes that wouldn't quite go away. Sarah had attributed it to stress or perhaps the adjustment to a different diet. But on this particular morning, during rounds, Sarah noticed that Alice's skin looked slightly yellow. Jaundice. Sarah's heart began to beat faster as she moved closer to the bed, her trained eye cataloging details she desperately wished she wasn't seeing. Alice was sitting up, knitting one of her baby blankets, and in the pale November light filtering through the window, her skin had taken on an unmistakable golden hue. Mrs. Brenner, Sarah said carefully, setting down her clipboard, have you noticed any changes in the color of your urine? Has it seemed darker than usual? Alice paused in her knitting, the needles going still in her yellowed hands. Maybe? I wasn't really paying attention. Should I have been? It's all right, Sarah said, though nothing was all right. I just need to check a few things. Would you look up at the ceiling for me? Alice complied, and Sarah gently pulled down the lower lids of her eyes to examine the sclera. They were definitely icteric, tinged with the telltale yellow that hadn't been there during last week's examination. Sarah felt her stomach clench. Does this hurt? Sarah asked, carefully palpating Alice's abdomen, feeling for the liver edge. It was there, just below the rib margin, slightly enlarged and tender. Alice winced when Sarah pressed. A little, Alice admitted, but everything's been hurting lately. My joints especially. I thought maybe I was coming down with something. The flu, perhaps. Sarah stepped back from the bed, her mind racing through differential diagnoses even as a darker certainty was forming in her gut. I'm going to run some additional tests, Alice. Blood work to see what might be causing these symptoms. In the meantime, I want you to rest and drink plenty of water. And if you notice any other symptoms, anything at all that feels different, I want you to tell a nurse immediately. Don't wait for rounds." "You're scaring me, doctor," Alice said quietly, her knitting forgotten in her lap. "Is it serious?" Sarah wanted to lie, to offer reassurance, to tell Alice that everything would be fine. But she had told too many lies already, and the weight of them was crushing her. "I don't know yet," she said instead. "But I promise you, I'm going to find out what's happening and I'm going to take care of you. That's a promise, Alice?" Alice nodded slowly, picking up her knitting again with trembling hands. "I trust you, Dr. Chin. You've been so good to me. To all of us." Sarah left the room before Alice could see the tears forming in her eyes. She went immediately to the laboratory and filled out a requisition for a comprehensive liver function panel, marking it as urgent. Her hands were shaking as she wrote, and she had to pause twice to steady herself. When she handed the form to the head lab technician, he frowned. "This patient is part of the nutrition study, right? I thought all their labs were being sent to Washington." "This is separate," Sarah said firmly, her voice brooking no argument. "This is for immediate clinical management. The patient is showing signs of possible liver dysfunction, and I need these results today." The technician shrugged. "Your call, doctor. I'll have it ready by 4 o'clock. Sarah spent the rest of the morning examining her other patients with a mounting sense of dread. Thomas Wright, the 53-year-old farmer who had been teaching chess to the others, complained of fatigue that seemed disproportionate to his activity level. When Sarah examined him more closely, she found the same subtle yellowing of his skin, the same tenderness in his upper right abdomen. Mary Sullivan, the former factory worker who spent her days knitting, had developed a rash on her arms that she'd been dismissing as dry skin. But when Sarah looked at it closely, she recognized it as something more concerning, the kind of inflammatory response that sometimes accompanied liver dysfunction. By lunchtime, Sarah had identified 5 of her 10 patients with suspicious symptoms. She skipped the cafeteria and went directly to her office, closing the door and leaning against it as if she could somehow keep the terrible truth from forcing its way in. But the truth was already inside with her, sitting in her chest like a stone. She pulled out her hidden notebook from the false bottom of her desk drawer and began writing frantically, documenting everything she'd observed. The timeline of Alice's symptoms, the physical findings in each patient, the pattern that was emerging. Her handwriting grew increasingly illegible as her hand cramped, but she didn't stop. This had to be recorded. Someone had to know. At 3:47, the lab results arrived. Sarah read them standing in the laboratory, her hands gripping the counter for support as the numbers swam before her eyes. Elevated bilirubin, both direct and indirect. Elevated liver enzymes, ALT at 285 units per liter, nearly 7 times the upper limit of normal. AST at 312. Alkaline phosphatase significantly elevated. Low albumin. Mildly prolonged prothrombin time, indicating the liver's synthetic function was already being compromised. This wasn't a simple nutritional deficiency. This was significant hepatotoxicity, liver damage, rapid and severe. And Alice's intake physical 5 weeks ago had shown completely normal liver function. Sarah's hands were shaking so badly she nearly dropped the report. The lab technician looked at her with concern. "Dr. Chin? Are you all right? Do you need to sit down?" "I need," Sarah said, her voice coming from very far away, "I need to order liver panels on 9 more patients. Immediately. Can you process them this afternoon?" "9 more? Doctor, that's..." "Please," Sarah interrupted, and there must have been something in her voice because the technician nodded quickly. "I'll make it happen." By 6 o'clock that evening, Sarah had the results for all 10 of her patients. She sat in her office with the reports spread across her desk like evidence at a crime scene, which is exactly what they were. 7 out of 10 showed liver dysfunction. 3, including Alice, had values indicating significant hepatic injury. The pattern was undeniable, irrefutable, damning. Whatever was in those standardized meals the patients were receiving, it was poisoning them. Sarah's first instinct was to go immediately to Morrison, to show him the evidence, to demand that the study be stopped. But something made her pause. A memory of Morrison's face when he'd first told her about the study, the careful way he'd chosen his words, the things he hadn't said. Instead, she picked up her phone and called the hospital's medical records department. "This is Dr. Chin. I need the liver function results for all 30 nutrition study patients. Every test that's been run since admission." "Dr. Chin, those records are restricted." Dr. Morrison gave specific instructions. I'm aware of Dr. Morrison's instructions, Sarah said, injecting steel into her voice. But I have patients showing signs of acute liver toxicity, and I need to know if this is an isolated issue or a pattern across the entire study population. Lives may be at stake. Are you going to help me, or am I going to have to go over your head? There was a pause, then a sigh. I'll pull what I can. It'll take me about an hour. Thank you. I'll be in my office. Sarah hung up and stared at the phone for a long moment. She had just crossed a line, had gone behind Morrison's back, had started asking questions that people in power didn't want asked. There would be consequences for this. But looking at Alice Brenner's lab results, at the evidence of poison accumulating in a trusting woman's liver, Sarah found she didn't care about consequences anymore. The medical records arrived at 7:15, delivered by a nervous clerk who wouldn't meet Sarah's eyes. Sarah thanked her and closed the door, then spread the files across every available surface in her office. What she found made her physically ill. The liver dysfunction wasn't limited to her patients. It was happening across the board. 18 out of 30 study participants showed elevated liver enzymes. 6 had clinical jaundice. And the progression was clear when she arranged the results chronologically: normal values at admission, subtle changes in week 2, clear abnormalities by week 4, and accelerating damage in week 5. But what made Sarah's blood run cold was what she found in the nursing notes, buried in the daily observations that most doctors never bothered to read in detail. Week 3, patient A07 reports mild nausea after meals. Week 3, patient B12 complaining of fatigue and loss of appetite. Week 4, patient C03 observed vomiting after dinner, attributed to stomach flu. Week 4, multiple patients reporting joint pain and headaches. The symptoms had been there all along. They'd been documented, recorded, noted in charts. And everyone had dismissed them as minor complaints, as adjustment issues, as the ordinary discomforts of people whose bodies were recovering from malnutrition. No one had put the pieces together. Or worse, someone had and had chosen to do nothing. Sarah was reading through the nursing notes for a third time when her office door opened without warning. She looked up to find Morrison standing in the doorway, his face unreadable. "The records department called me," he said quietly. "Said you'd requisition restricted files." Sarah didn't bother to deny it. She gestured at the papers covering her office. "Did you know?" Morrison stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "Did I know what?" "About the liver damage. About what's happening to these people." Morrison was quiet for a long moment, studying the files spread across Sarah's desk. Then he walked to her window and looked out at the darkened river. "I knew something was wrong," he said finally. "The last weekly report from Washington showed elevated enzyme levels in several patients. I called Dr. Brennan to discuss it. And he assured me it was within expected parameters for the study." Sarah felt something sharp and hot rising in her chest. "Expected parameters? Morrison, we have patients with liver enzyme levels 7 times normal. Alice Brenner is jaundiced. This isn't within expected parameters. This is toxicity. This is poisoning." Morrison turned to face her, and for the first time since she'd known him, he looked old. Tired and old and frightened. "I know," he said. The admission hung in the air between them. "You know," Sarah repeated slowly. "You know, and you're letting it continue? It's not that simple." "It's exactly that simple." Sarah stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "We have 30 people who came here for help, who trusted us to care for them, and we're systematically damaging their livers. How is that complicated?" Morrison's jaw tightened. "Sit down, Sarah. There are things you need to understand about this study." "I don't want to sit down. I want you to tell me we're stopping this right now. Tonight. I want you to tell me we're informing the patients, offering treatment, ending this nightmare." "I can't do that." "Why not?" Morrison moved to her desk and picked up one of the lab reports, studying it as if the numbers might somehow rearrange themselves into something less damning. "2 weeks ago," he said quietly, "I received the full study protocol. The real one. Not the sanitized version they gave us at the beginning." Sarah felt her heart begin to pound. "What are you talking about?" "The study isn't about nutritional deficiencies, Sarah. It's never been about that." He set down the report and met her eyes. "It's a toxicity study. They're testing the hepatotoxic effects of high-dose vitamin A and D supplementation in malnourished populations." The room seemed to tilt. Sarah gripped the edge of her desk. "They're deliberately poisoning them," she whispered. "They're studying the safety thresholds of vitamin fortification," Morrison corrected, but his voice was hollow. With the government planning to implement widespread food fortification programs, they needed to understand the potential for overdose, especially in vulnerable populations. The doses being administered are within ranges that someone might theoretically consume if they were taking multiple supplements. That's a rationalization and you know it, Sarah interrupted. No one accidentally takes doses high enough to cause this kind of damage. They're not studying accidental overdose, they're deliberately inducing liver toxicity to see what happens. To measure it, to document the progression. Morrison didn't argue. He simply stood there looking at the evidence scattered across Sarah's office and said nothing. How long have you known? Sarah asked. 2 weeks. And you didn't tell me. You let me keep drawing their blood, keep reassuring them, keep lying to them about why they were feeling sick. What would you have had me do? Morrison's voice rose. Blow the whistle? Shut down the study? Do you have any idea what that would mean? The hospital would lose millions in federal funding. Our research contracts would be terminated. I could lose my medical license for breach of contract. You could lose yours. I don't care about my license, Sarah shouted. I care about Alice Brenner and Thomas Wright and Mary Sullivan and 27 other people who are being poisoned while we watch. And what happens to them if we stop the study? Morrison shot back. They go back to their lives. Back to poverty and hunger and illness. At least here they're being monitored. At least here, if someone develops truly life-threatening complications, we can intervene. Can we? Sarah demanded. Can we really? Or will Brennan tell us that intervention would compromise the data? That we need to let the toxicity run its course so they can measure the full progression? Morrison didn't answer. Sarah walked to her window, pressing her forehead against the cold glass. Outside, the river moved through the darkness, patient and eternal, carrying poison downstream just like it always had. Industrial waste, agricultural runoff, the contaminated debris of progress. The river took it all and carried it away, and people downstream drank it and bathed in it and believed it was clean because the authorities said it was safe. I went into medicine to help people, Sarah said quietly. Do you remember that feeling, Morrison? When we first started. The belief that we could make a difference, that we could ease suffering, that we could be a force for good in the world. Sarah. They trust us, she continued, still looking out at the river. Alice cries when she talks about how grateful she is for our care. Thomas calls me Doc like I'm family. Mary keeps knitting blankets to send home to her grandchildren because she believes she's going to get well enough to see them again. She turned to face Morrison. What are we going to tell them when their livers fail? When the jaundice gets worse and they start bleeding because their clotting factors are shot? When they develop hepatic encephalopathy and can't remember their own names? Morrison's face had gone pale. It won't get that far, Brennan assured me. Brennan lied to you, Sarah said flatly. He lied about the purpose of the study. He lied about the consent process. He lied about the expected parameters. Why would you believe anything he tells you now? Morrison sat down heavily in Sarah's chair, suddenly looking every one of his 46 years. What do you want me to do? Sarah picked up Alice's lab results, held them up. I want you to call Brennan right now and tell him the study is over. I want you to inform the patients about what's been done to them. I want you to start them on treatment, milk thistle, N-acetylcysteine, whatever we can do to support their liver function. And I want you to file a report with the medical board about the ethical violations. Morrison shook his head slowly. I can't do that. Can't or won't. Both. He looked up at her with eyes full of anguish. Sarah, this study has backing at the highest levels of government. Brennan made that very clear. If we try to expose it, if we try to stop it, they'll bury us. They'll destroy our careers, discredit our findings, and the study will continue somewhere else with doctors who ask fewer questions. So we just let it happen? We just watch them suffer. We document everything, Morrison said. We keep detailed records. We intervene when we can, when it won't completely compromise the study. And when it's over, when we have all the evidence compiled, then maybe we can bring it to light in a way that might actually matter. Sarah stared at him in disbelief. You want me to be complicit in this for another 5 months? To keep drawing blood and watching them get sicker and pretending it's for their own good? I want you to be smart about this, Morrison said urgently. I want you to think about the long game. If we blow the whistle now, we become the story, two disgruntled doctors making unsubstantiated claims. But if we document everything, if we build an airtight case, if we wait until we have evidence that can't be dismissed or buried, then maybe we can actually stop this from happening again. To other people. In other hospitals. Sarah thought about this. She thought about Ruth Hargrove's friend in Alabama, About the syphilis study where men were left untreated for decades while researchers watched them die. She thought about how that study had continued for 40 years because no one with evidence had been willing to speak up, or because the ones who did were silenced. How do we know they'll ever let the evidence see the light? She asked. How do we know this won't just disappear into some classified file in Washington? We don't, Morrison admitted. But what's the alternative? We quit and they replace us with doctors who won't care. We report it now and they destroy our credibility before anyone hears what we have to say. At least this way we're present. We're watching. We can minimize the harm as much as possible. Sarah walked back to her desk and gathered up the lab reports, stacking them carefully. I need to think about this. Fair enough. Morrison stood. But Sarah, whatever you decide, be careful. These are powerful people we're dealing with. They don't like loose ends. After Morrison left, Sarah sat alone in her office, surrounded by evidence of systematic harm, and tried to figure out what the right thing to do was. She thought about Alice Brenner's trust, about the promise she'd made to take care of her. She thought about the oath she'd taken to do no harm. She thought about all the ways that harm could be done, through action and inaction, through lies of commission and lies of omission, through the choices you made and the choices you failed to make. Outside her window, the river flowed on in darkness, carrying secrets and lies toward the sea. Sarah pulled out her notebook and began to write, documenting everything Morrison had told her, every detail of the real study protocol, every piece of evidence she'd gathered. If she was going to be complicit in this horror, then she would at least make sure that someone, someday, would know the truth. It was nearly midnight when she finally left the hospital. She walked home through empty streets, past darkened houses where ordinary people slept in their beds, believing they were safe, believing the institutions they trusted would protect them. Sarah thought about going to the police, to the newspapers, to anyone who might listen. But Morrison was right about one thing. Without proof, without documentation that couldn't be dismissed, she was just one doctor making wild accusations against the United States government. So she would document. She would watch. She would bear witness. And she would wait for the moment when the truth could no longer be denied, when the evidence was so overwhelming that even the powerful people behind this study couldn't make it disappear. She just hoped that moment would come before it was too late for Alice Brenner and the 29 other people whose trust she was betraying with every breath she took. The next morning, Sarah returned to the hospital before dawn. She checked on Alice first, found her sleeping fitfully, the yellow tinge of her skin unmistakable in the dim light. Sarah stood at the bedside and made a promise, not aloud but in the silence of her own heart. I will remember. I will document. And someday I will make sure the world knows what was done to you. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was all she had. Chapter 4, Climax. The call came at 2:47 in the morning on a Tuesday in late December, shattering the fragile sleep Sarah had finally managed to find. Dr. Chin? The night nurse's voice was tight with barely controlled panic. You need to come in. It's Alice Brenner. She's bleeding and we can't get it to stop. Sarah was dressed and out the door in less than 3 minutes, running through streets slick with fresh snow, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The hospital loomed ahead, its windows glowing yellow against the black sky like a ship lost at sea. She found Alice's room in chaos. 2 nurses were working frantically, one holding pressure on Alice's arm where the 4 had been, the other trying to stanch bleeding from her nose. The white sheets were spotted with bright red blood, and more was seeping from Alice's gums, staining her teeth pink. How long has this been going on? Sarah demanded, pulling on gloves. Started about 20 minutes ago, the senior nurse said. She called for help because of the nosebleed, and when I came in to check on her, she was bleeding from the foresight. I've been holding pressure but it won't clot. Sarah's mind raced through the implications. Spontaneous bleeding from multiple sites meant Alice's clotting factors were severely compromised. Her liver was no longer able to produce the proteins necessary for normal coagulation. This was exactly what Sarah had feared, what she'd warned Morrison about weeks ago. Get me a CBC, PT, PTT and fibrinogen level stat, Sarah ordered. And I need FFP, fresh frozen plasma, at least 4 units, and vitamin K 10 milligrams for now. As the nurses rushed to comply, Sarah moved to Alice's bedside. The woman's eyes were wide with terror, her yellowed face even more jaundiced than it had been during yesterday's rounds. Dr. Chin, Alice whispered, blood trickling from the corner of her mouth. What's happening to me? Sarah took Alice's hand, careful not to squeeze too hard for fear of causing more bruising. Your blood isn't clotting the way it should. We're going to give you medicine to help with that. I need you to stay calm and try not to move around too much. Am I dying? The question hung in the air like smoke. Sarah looked into Alice's frightened eyes and felt something break inside her chest. All the careful lies, all the professional distance, all the rationalizations she'd been telling herself for the past 2 months. No, Sarah said firmly. I'm not going to let that happen. She turned to the nurses. Where's that plasma? Blood bank is sending it up now. Not fast enough. Call them and tell them I'm coming down to get it myself. Sarah ran to the blood bank, her footsteps echoing in the empty hallways. She signed out the plasma personally, carried it back upstairs cradled against her chest like something precious and fragile, which it was. It might be the only thing standing between Alice and a catastrophic hemorrhage. She hung the first unit herself, watching the pale yellow fluid drip into Alice's vein, willing it to work to give Alice's body the clotting factors it so desperately needed. Start another large bore 4, Sarah instructed. And keep holding pressure on that nosebleed. Someone paged Dr. Morrison. Tell him it's urgent. Morrison arrived 20 minutes later, still in his coat, snow melting in his hair. Sarah met him in the hallway outside Alice's room. Acute coagulopathy, she said without preamble. Her PT is over 60 seconds. She's in liver failure, Morrison. This is what we knew would happen if we didn't stop the study. Morrison's face was ashen. Have you called Brennan? No. Should I have? So he can tell us to document the bleeding and see how long it takes her to die. Sarah. I'm starting treatment, Sarah interrupted. Full supportive care. Plasma, vitamin K, lactulose if she develops encephalopathy. And I'm stopping the fortified meals. She gets regular hospital food from now on, nothing from the study protocol. You can't do that. You'll compromise the entire dataset. I don't give a damn about the dataset. Sarah's voice rose, sharp enough to make a passing orderly turn and stare. She lowered her voice to a harsh whisper. Alice Brenner is a human being, not a data point. And she's bleeding to death because we've been poisoning her for 2 months. I'm stopping it. No. Tonight. And if Brennan has a problem with that, he can come here and explain to Alice why her suffering is more important than her life. Morrison stared at her for a long moment. Then slowly he nodded. All right, he said quietly. Start the treatment. I'll handle Brennan. Sarah went back into Alice's room. The bleeding had slowed somewhat with the plasma infusion, but Alice looked terrible, pale beneath the jaundice, her breathing shallow and rapid. Am I going to be all right, doctor? Alice asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah pulled up a chair and sat beside the bed. For the first time since this nightmare began, she decided to tell the truth. Alice, I need to tell you something. About why you've been getting sick. She explained it all. The real purpose of the study, the toxic doses of vitamins, the liver damage that had been deliberately induced and carefully measured. She watched Alice's expression shift from confusion to disbelief to a kind of terrible understanding. You mean, Alice said slowly, all this time when I was getting sicker instead of better, it was because of the food you were giving me? Yes. And you knew. Sarah felt tears burning in her eyes. Not at first, but yes, I knew. For the past several weeks, I knew and I didn't stop it. I'm so sorry, Alice. I'm so desperately sorry. Alice was quiet for a long time, her yellowed eyes studying Sarah's face. Why? She asked finally. Why would you do that? Because I was afraid, Sarah admitted. Afraid of losing my career, afraid of going up against powerful people, afraid that trying to stop it would only make things worse. I told myself I was documenting evidence, building a case, waiting for the right moment. But the truth is I was just a coward. Alice's hand tightened slightly around Sarah's. What about the others? Thomas and Mary and all the rest. They're sick too. Not all as bad as you, but they're all showing liver damage. Do they know? Not yet. Alice closed her eyes. A tear tracked down her jaundiced cheek. You have to tell them. They deserve to know the truth. I will, Sarah promised. First thing in the morning. And Alice, I'm going to fix this. I'm going to make sure people know what was done to you. To all of you. I don't know how yet, but I promise you I will make this right. You're a good person, Dr. Chin, Alice whispered. You made a mistake, but you're trying to fix it. That's more than most people would do. Sarah sat with Alice through the night, monitoring her vital signs, adjusting the plasma infusions, watching the blood slowly clot at the 4 sites and under the pressure dressings. By dawn, Alice's condition had stabilized, though she remained critically ill. At 7 o'clock, Sarah called an emergency meeting with Morrison and the other physicians managing study patients. When they were all assembled in the conference room, she presented her findings. Detailed documentation of liver damage progression across all 30 patients. Lab values showing the correlation between time in study and degree of hepatotoxicity, and the clear evidence that this was not accidental but deliberate. We need to stop this study today, Sarah concluded. We need to inform the patients, start treatment, and report this to the appropriate authorities. Dr. James Holloway, who managed 10 of the patients in another ward, shook his head. You're talking about ending a federally funded research program based on what? Some elevated liver enzymes? These people came to us malnourished. Of course their lab values aren't perfect. This isn't imperfect lab values, Sarah shot back. This is acute hepatotoxicity. One patient nearly bled to death last night because her liver can't produce clotting factors anymore. One patient with a complication doesn't justify 18 patients. Sarah slammed her hand on the table. 18 out of 30 showing significant liver damage. This isn't a complication. It's a pattern. It's cause and effect. And we're the cause. Ruth Hargrove spoke up from the back of the room. I've been reviewing the nursing notes on my patients. Sarah's right. The symptoms have been there all along: nausea, fatigue, abdominal pain. We've been dismissing them as adjustment issues, but they're clearly related to hepatotoxicity. If we stop the study now, Holloway argued, we invalidate all the data. Months of research wasted. Good, Sarah said flatly. This research shouldn't exist. It's unethical, it's causing harm, and it needs to end. Morrison, who had been silent throughout the meeting, finally spoke. I've already contacted Dr. Brennan. He's arriving this afternoon to discuss the situation. There's nothing to discuss, Sarah said. We're stopping the study. The patients will be informed today, treatment will begin immediately, and I'm filing a formal complaint with the state medical board. Sarah, you need to think carefully about this, Morrison warned. You're talking about destroying your career. My career isn't worth Alice Brenner's life, Sarah replied. And it's not worth my ability to sleep at night. The meeting broke up in tense silence. Sarah went directly to the nurse's station and began pulling patient charts. She would tell them herself, every single one of them, what had been done to them. She started with Thomas Wright. Mr. Wright, I need to talk to you about the nutrition study you've been part of. Thomas set down his chess pieces and looked at her with concern. Is something wrong, Doc? Yes, Sarah said. Something is very wrong. And you deserve to know the truth. She told him everything. Watched his weathered face cycle through shock, anger, betrayal, and finally a kind of weary resignation. I should have known, he said quietly. Nothing in this life comes free, does it? Always a catch. Always someone looking to use you. I'm so sorry, Mr. Wright. Don't apologize to me, document. You didn't design this study. You're just the one with enough guts to tell the truth. He paused. The others, do they know yet? I'm telling everyone today. Good. They deserve that much. He looked down at his chessboard. What happens now? Now we treat you. We stop the toxic supplements, we support your liver function, we monitor you closely. And we make sure this never happens again to anyone else. Thomas nodded slowly. You know what the worst part is? I was actually feeling better. Gaining weight, getting my strength back. I thought maybe things were finally turning around for me. He laughed bitterly. Guess the joke's on me. Sarah spent the rest of the morning moving from room to room, telling truth after uncomfortable truth. Some patients cried. Some raged. Some, like Alice, simply seemed resigned, as if they'd always known that good things didn't happen to people like them. By noon, all 30 patients knew they had been used as test subjects without their consent, that they had been deliberately poisoned, that the people they trusted to care for them had betrayed that trust in the most fundamental way possible. And Sarah had to live with the knowledge that she'd been part of it. Dr. Brennan arrived at 3 o'clock, flanked by 2 men in dark suits who didn't introduce themselves but radiated government authority. Morrison had arranged for them to meet in his office, away from the patients. Dr. Chen, Brennan said when Sarah entered. I understand you've taken it upon yourself to inform the study participants about the research protocols. I told them the truth, Sarah said. Something that should have been done from the beginning. You've contaminated the study, one of the suited men said coldly. Do you have any idea how much federal money has been invested in this research? Do you have any idea how many people you've harmed? Sarah shot back. One of my patients nearly died last night because her liver is failing. Because you've been poisoning her. We've been conducting vital research, Brennan said. Research that will inform public health policy for decades. The fortification of food supplies could prevent countless nutritional deficiencies. By causing countless liver failures instead? Sarah interrupted. This research is built on deception and harm. It's unethical, it's illegal, and I'm reporting it. The second suited man stepped forward. Dr. Chen, I would strongly advise you to reconsider. Your medical career is just beginning. It would be a shame to see it end over a misunderstanding. Is that a threat? It's a reality check, he replied. No one will believe you. You have no proof, no credibility. You're one junior physician making wild accusations against a federally funded research program. Who do you think the medical community will side with? Sarah pulled a thick folder from her bag and dropped it on Morrison's desk. I have 2 months of detailed documentation. Lab results, patient testimonies, nursing notes, correspondence. Everything. And copies of all of it are in a safe place where you can't get to them. The room went very quiet. Brennan's jaw tightened. You're making a serious mistake, Dr. Chin. The mistake was made when you decided human beings were acceptable research subjects without their knowledge or consent, Sarah replied. I'm just making sure there's a record of it. She turned to Morrison. I'm resigning my position at Riverside General, effective immediately. I will not be part of this institution as long as this study continues. Morrison's face was gray. Sarah, please. Think about what you're doing. I have thought about it, Sarah said. Every single day for the past 2 months. And I'm done being complicit. She walked out of the office, out of the hospital, into the December afternoon. Behind her, she left her career, her security, her carefully planned future. Ahead of her lay uncertainty, struggle, and the very real possibility that her sacrifice would mean nothing, that the powerful men in that office would bury the evidence and destroy her credibility, and the study would continue somewhere else with different victims. But she had done what she should have done from the beginning. She had chosen truth over comfort. She had chosen her patients over her career. She had chosen to be the kind of doctor, the kind of person, who could look herself in the mirror. Would have to be enough. Chapter 5. Resolution and Reflection. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in March, 3 months after Sarah had walked out of Riverside General Hospital for the last time. She was working at a free clinic on the south side of the city, treating patients who couldn't afford regular medical care, living in a smaller apartment, surviving on a fraction of her former salary. The state medical board had declined to investigate her complaint about the nutrition study, citing insufficient evidence of wrongdoing. The newspapers she'd contacted had been politely uninterested. The story of 30 poor people being used as test subjects apparently wasn't newsworthy enough to risk angering federal officials. Sarah had begun to believe that nothing would ever come of her documentation, that Morrison and Brennan and the men in dark suits had been right. She was just one doctor with no power, no platform, and no way to make people listen. Then the letter came. It was from Alice Brenner. Dear Dr. Chin, I hope this letter finds you well. The nurses told me you left the hospital, and I've been wanting to write to you ever since. First, I want to thank you. I know you think you failed us, that you should have stopped the study sooner. But you were the only one who told us the truth. You were the only one who risked everything to do the right thing. That matters more than you know. My liver is healing. Slowly, but it's healing. The doctors say I might make a full recovery, though it will take time. Thomas Wright is doing well too. We've become friends, him and me and some of the others. We meet once a week at the church down the street from where I'm staying with my sister. We call ourselves the Survivors Group, which makes us sound more dramatic than we are. Mostly we just drink coffee and talk about what happened and try to make sense of it all. Here's what I wanted you to know, we're not staying quiet. Thomas has a nephew who works for a newspaper in St. Louis. We've been talking to him, all of us, telling our stories. He says he's going to write about what happened to us. He says people need to know. I don't know if it will make a difference, but we're going to try. Because of you. Because you showed us that even when the powerful people tell you to be quiet and accept what's been done to you, you can still speak up. You can still fight back. Thank you for caring about us when no one else did. Thank you for remembering our names. With gratitude, Alice Brenner. Sarah read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face. Then she picked up the phone and called the number Alice had included at the bottom of the page. The article appeared in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch 6 weeks later, a full-page investigation titled Human Guinea Pigs, the Secret Study That Poisoned 30 Americans. It included interviews with 15 of the study participants, testimonies from nurses who had witnessed the progression of symptoms, and copies of some of Sarah's documentation. Enough to make the story credible, not enough to reveal everything she had saved. The response was immediate and volcanic. Within days, 3 members of Congress had called for investigations. The Department of Health issued a terse statement denying any ethical violations while quietly shutting down the study. Dr. Brennan was reassigned to a desk job in Washington. Morrison was asked to resign from Riverside General. And Sarah received a call from an attorney in Washington, a woman named Margaret Harrison who specialized in medical ethics cases. "I want to file a class action lawsuit on behalf of the study participants," Margaret said. "And I need your documentation. All of it. Every note you took, every lab result you saved, every piece of evidence you have." "They'll come after me," Sarah said. "The government. They'll destroy my career, my reputation." "They'll try," Margaret agreed. "But you'll have something they don't expect. You'll have the truth, and you'll have 30 people willing to stand up in court and testify about what was done to them. That's powerful, Dr. Chin. More powerful than you realize." Sarah thought about Alice Brenner crying over butter and soft beds, believing that someone finally cared about what happened to her. She thought about Thomas Wright teaching chess and trying to believe that things could get better. She thought about all of them trusting her, forgiving her, and now fighting back. "All right," Sarah said. "I'll do it." The lawsuit took 2 years to wind its way through the courts. 2 years of depositions and testimony, of character assassination and desperate legal maneuvering from government attorneys trying to suppress evidence and discredit witnesses. But the participants stood firm. Alice testified about bleeding from her nose and gums while doctors took notes and did nothing. Thomas talked about the headaches and nausea that had been dismissed as adjustment issues. Mary Sullivan, the woman who had knitted baby blankets, described watching her skin turn yellow and being told it was just a vitamin deficiency. And Sarah testified about everything she'd seen, everything she'd documented, everything she'd been told to ignore. In the end, the government settled. $3 million split among the 30 participants. Not nearly enough to compensate for what had been done to them, but enough to acknowledge that harm had been caused, that wrong had been done, that the United States government had failed in its most basic duty to protect its citizens. The settlement included one other provision, inserted at Sarah's insistence. The Department of Health would establish new ethical guidelines for human subjects research, including mandatory informed consent, independent review boards, and protections for vulnerable populations. It wasn't justice, but it was something. Sarah was 34 years old when the lawsuit was finally settled. She had been working at the free clinic for 3 years, had built a practice serving the people others ignored, had learned that medicine could be about more than career advancement and institutional prestige. She attended the settlement announcement at Alice's request, standing in the back of the courtroom while the judge read the terms and the participants wept with relief and rage and a complicated mixture of vindication and sorrow for all they'd lost. Afterward, they gathered on the courthouse steps, not all 30 but most of them. Alice was there, looking healthier now, her liver function almost normal. Thomas Wright stood beside her, his arm around his wife who had stood by him through everything. Mary Sullivan held the hand of a grandchild she'd finally been able to visit. Alice saw Sarah and broke into a smile. She pushed through the crowd and wrapped Sarah in a fierce hug. "We did it," Alice whispered. "We actually did it." "You did it," Sarah corrected. "You were brave enough to speak up. You were brave enough to listen," Alice replied. "And brave enough to lose everything to do the right thing. That's what made the difference, Dr. Chin. You showed us that our suffering mattered. That we mattered." That evening, Sarah walked along the river where she'd stood so many times during those terrible months, watching the water and trying to decide what kind of person she wanted to be. She thought about the choices she'd made, the ones she was proud of and the ones that still kept her awake at night. She had waited too long to speak up. She had been complicit in harm. She had prioritized her career over her patients' well-being, at least for a while. But she had also, eventually, done the right thing. She had told the truth when it cost her everything. She had stood beside her patients when they needed an ally. She had helped ensure that what happened to them would be documented, acknowledged, and, perhaps, prevented from happening to others. It wasn't redemption. You couldn't redeem betrayal, couldn't undo the harm that had been done. But it was something. The river flowed past, patient and eternal, carrying away secrets and lies and the contaminated waste of progress. But it also carried renewal, the promise that water, given time, could cleanse itself. That truth, given time, could surface. That people, given the chance, could choose courage over comfort. Sarah pulled out the small notebook she still carried everywhere, the one where she documented everything during those dark months. She opened it to the first page where she'd written the names. Alice Brenner, Thomas Wright, Mary Sullivan. 30 names. 30 people who had trusted the wrong institutions but found the strength to fight back anyway. She would never forget them. That had been her promise in the beginning, and it was the one promise she had kept completely. Sarah closed the notebook and put it back in her pocket. Then she turned away from the river and walked toward home, toward the life she was building, toward the person she was becoming, flawed and scarred and still trying, every day, to be worthy of the trust that people like Alice Brenner placed in doctors who promised to care for them. Behind her, the river moved on in the gathering darkness. Ahead of her, the city lights began to glow, ordinary and beautiful, illuminating ordinary streets where ordinary people lived ordinary lives and sometimes, just sometimes, found the courage to demand that the truth be told and the powerful be held accountable. It wasn't the ending Sarah had imagined when she first walked into Riverside General Hospital on that October morning, full of ambition and certainty. But it was the ending that mattered. And in the quiet of her own heart, in the space where she kept her most fundamental truths, Sarah knew that she had finally learned what it meant to be a doctor. Not the image she'd held of professional success and institutional respect, but the deeper truth of bearing witness, speaking truth, and standing with the vulnerable even when it cost everything. The government had known what was being done. They had watched while people suffered. But one doctor had refused to stay silent. And 30 people had refused to be forgotten. In the end, perhaps that was enough. Perhaps it had to be. The last light faded from the sky, and Sarah walked home through streets filled with people who would never know what had happened in that hospital, who would never read the settlement documents or understand how close they all were, always, to becoming subjects rather than citizens, data points rather than human beings. But Alice knew. Thomas knew. The others knew. And they would remember. They would tell their children and grandchildren about the time the government used them as test subjects, and about the doctor who risked everything to tell the truth. The story would live on, a warning and a promise, that vigilance was necessary, that courage mattered, that even in the darkest moments, someone might stand up and say, "No more." Sarah reached her apartment and climbed the stairs, her notebook heavy in her pocket, her conscience lighter than it had been in years. She had finally learned to live with herself. And that, after everything, was worth more than any career could ever be.